As you as participants in this workshop might know, there are going to be two sessions. The first session is moderated by me, the second one by Irma. In the first session, we're going to have three speakers, Javier Garcia Bernardo, Johannes Roquet, and Sarah Godard. In the second session, we're going to have Frederick Heitmiller, Danuša Nerudová, and Saila Stausholm, and Frankie Hackett. Each speaker, now a bit of housekeeping rules, each speaker has up to 15 minutes for their presentation. And after all the presentations are done in the given session, we will have half an hour for questions and answers. To ask questions, please write your question in the chat function, and you will then be asked by the moderator, either me or Irma, to say it aloud during the session. Please keep muted unless you are invited to speak, of course. We were originally, before we proceed with the presentations, let me add a few words on country-by-country reporting. And when we were setting up this workshop, we were hoping and we were agreeing with Kim Closing to have one of the presentations, but she has since been sworn in as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis. So she unfortunately does not have the time to be with us. But she has suggested that, you know, I could briefly present some of her slides that she shared with me. And so I'm, you know, going to make use of her one or two slides as a brief introduction into this workshop on country-by-country reporting. And as many of you will know or will know at the end of this workshop, there are various country-by-country reporting regulations and various data sources arriving from this. So we have CBCR regulations in extractive industries. We have another set of regulations and data in for financial institutions, including European banks. And you know, most recently, we have country-by-country reporting for large multinational corporations drawing on the OECD BEPS Action 13. And you know, the data has been published by OECD, but also, for example, United States, the IRS published its data with earlier and you know, for more years than the OECD has done. And the presentation by Kim Closing and her, I think now her great paper now published, looks at this data published by the United States, and she's drawing 5 lessons on profit shifting from the US country-by-country data. And you know, I want to use this slide, and I want to, you know, refer to her full paper for more detailed discussion. But so she refers to this BEPS Action 13 as the originator of the data, and she sees some advantages and some disadvantages in the data. And this is, I think, going to be shared across the speakers on the various CBCR data sets. So some of the advantages is that there is more country coverage, and the data are actually presented in 2 versions, separately for those profit making and for all affiliates of multinational corporations. So this allows a more accurate estimation of effective tax rates. There are also some disadvantages. There's no time series, or you know, there's 1-2 years of US data, but not consistent over the years yet. There's you know, limited release of non-US data, which have been only, you know, for some countries published by the OECD, as the first presentation by Javier will likely mention. And there's some confusion in reporting and possible double counting, but these issues can be addressed. And you know, I think my interpretation of Kim Closing's reading is that she's quite upbeat about the data. And with that, let me conclude this brief introduction, and let me pass the floor to my colleague Javier Garcia Bernardo, who's excellent social science researcher, and he's one of the postdoctoral researchers on CORPTAX. And he's going to present his research, our research, on profit shifting of multinational corporations worldwide. Javier, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. Super good presentation. Let me share my screen. I think it's working. Yeah, so as Peter has said, this is a paper that we just finished. It has been published as a working paper by the ICTD, the International Centre of Tax and Development in the UK. And the presentation that I'm going to talk about is about this paper and how we measure profit shifting of multinational corporations worldwide using this new data set. So our big question is, what is the scale of tax avoidance? This is a very old question with a lot of different answers, but we thought that we could improve on this because of two innovations. The first innovation is a new methodology. A lot of the methodologies, a lot of the papers working on tax avoidance assume a linear response between the tax rate and the profits. So what this means is that if a company is in a country with a tax rate of 20%, shifting the profits to a country with a 0% tax rate will be twice as advantageous as shifting from a country with a 10% tax rate to one with a 0% tax rate. But if you think a little bit about this, this is actually not real, because even theoretically, you can think that multinationals will always shift the profits to the place with the lowest tax rate. They are not going to have slightly larger incentives to shift profits to slightly lower tax rates. They will always go for the Cayman Islands or the Netherlands and Luxembourg. They're not going to go for countries with a tax rate of 15%. So one of our innovations, the other one is using this country-by-country reporting data, because it allows us to have a lot more coverage, as I will mention in a second. So answering this big question, we have two sub-questions, which are which countries lose the most and which companies harm the most, or are the most aggressive with respect to profit shifting. So just to give a little bit of context, these are some previous estimates of tax revenue losses due to corporate tax avoidance. And there's different methodologies, different papers. The last, our estimates are between 200 and 300 billions. And what we can say is that there's a consensus that profit shifting is going to be somewhere around 200 billions. The tax losses due to profit shifting will be around 200 billions. Which makes a lot of sense, because if you sum the profits that are in Cayman Islands, in Bermuda, and in a few other countries like that, you already have 100-something billions. So it's pretty easy to see that, you already have losses in other countries that sum up to 100 billion. So even if the Netherlands and Luxembourg and Ireland would not be very important, you would still get to these 200 billions easily. So yeah, the new data. Thank you, Peter, for the presentation. And I think most of you will know, but it has the aggregated profits and tax payments and operations of large multinationals in over 190 countries, which is great because it allows us for the first time to see some of the developing countries, to study developing countries. Other data sources, for example, the data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the US, I think has data for 3 African countries. The CBCR data has data for, I think, 20 or so for the US alone. Another thing that is great is that it has both profit-making affiliates and loss-making affiliates. I will come back to that in a second. And the third one is that there is not so much there is no double counting in revenue, and there is only limited double counting in profits. So a point that I wanted to make about the data, which I think some people will find it interesting, is that loss-making firms are really important. So what I'm showing in this graph in the x-axis are the total profits in the country made by profit-making affiliates, and in the y-axis are the profits offset by losses. So I'm comparing basically the profits by profit-making affiliates versus the profit of all firms. And you can see three clear areas. In red, in the bottom right corner, you see, well, the tax havens, the more clear tax havens like Bermuda or Cayman Islands or Puerto Rico. And in those countries, there are only companies that make profits. No company makes losses, basically. Then in red, in the top right corner, you have the United Kingdom, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. And in those countries, there is a lot of profits that are being booked, but there is also a lot of losses that are being booked, which indicates that they play as a conduit for other countries. And then in blue, you have the most normal countries where there is not so much profits that are being booked, and also most of the profits are offset by losses. So for example, the case of Germany, over 60%, or the case of Austria, over 80%. So we use the profit-making affiliates to calculate the effective tax rate, but we use all affiliates to calculate where the activity of multinational corporations take place. And because, just because you are making losses doesn't mean you are actually making losses. It can be that you are shifting the profits out of the country. And what I mentioned before is that we have a new methodology which challenges the basic idea of linearity. So I'll explain a little bit the most common model, which comes from the famous Hein and Rice paper of 1994. And in that one, you have that the location of profits depends on the location of capital and labor, and also the tax rate. And then you have some other controls. It doesn't really matter that much all those terms, but for simplicity, what I want you to think about is that profits depend on the tax rate, and it's linear. This B3 is the coefficient, this beta 3. So this is the basic model, and then there's an improvement by Dowd and another authors from 2017. And here they introduce a square term, which was actually already in the previous paper in Hines and Rice. And this already improves. This says that, okay, if you move the profits to a country that has a 0% tax rate, the incentives to do that are going to be way higher than if you move it to one, and that is 10%. But I'm going to show you that the problem is that this doesn't fit the data well. So yeah, all these axes are a little messed up, but the x-axis is showing the tax rate. It goes 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50%. And in the y-axis is the profit per employee. So the profit per employee, this is part of the Hines formula if you just reallocate some terms. And the linear assumption what says is that you can throw a line there and it's fitting the dots well. So all these dots are different countries, and in the left top corner you will have countries with a super high profit per employee and very low effective tax rate, and in the center bottom area in green you will have countries with a moderate effective tax rate around 20-30% and a moderate profit per employee. So basically the assumption of most of the literature even today is that you can throw a line through these points and this is okay. With the paper from Dowd and et al, you get a little better. You try to throw there a quadratic model, which means doing something like that. The problem here is that even this model is not enough to account for how nonlinear this is. In here, we want something that would be looking more like this. That is kind of flat at the beginning when the green area, when the tax rate is pretty high. And then when the tax rate gets really below 10%, it increases really fast. And to do this, we come up with a logarithmic model. So it's basically the same or exactly the same model as before, but now we have a logarithmic term. So if you look at here, tau I is the tax rate in the country, and when the tax rate is very small, then the logarithmic become really high. So the profits book the expected profits book will become really high. So that's the basic idea, to have a logarithmic tax rate. And this has quite important implications. So I'm showing you here for a country, Jersey, that has a tax rate according to the CBCR data of 0.1%, different models. The first one, misalignment, that one only looks at the profits that are in the country and compares it with the profits that we would expect based on the employees, based on the set of employees. And if we do that, we find that 96% of the profits are misaligned and shouldn't be there. The logarithmic model in red, in dark red, shows that 99% would do it. The quadratic model would say 92% would do it, would be shifted there artificially. And the linear model would say 63% would do it. If you compare with the estimates of the literature, which are the Tunes columns, those estimates would say that only between 20 and 40% of the profits in Jersey have been shifted there. If you look at a country with a tax rate of around 5%, like Switzerland, you find, according to the misalignment model, that 70% of the profits have been shifted there. According to our model, 70%. According to the quadratic model, they find even more, and the linear model around 50%. And again, the other estimates from the literature find very few profits being shifted there. And finally, if you look at a country like Ireland with a tax rate of 12%, you find for the misalignment model 35% of the profits that have been shifted there, which is very similar from the logarithmic model. But then here the quadratic and the linear model give higher estimates than what we expect from the other two models. And if I want to show you this visually, this is basically the lines that I show you in the previous plot. So the tax rate, and here in the y-axis you have the increase in profits. We're comparing the country with a hypothetical country with a tax rate of 25%. So let's say a country with a tax rate of around 5%, like Switzerland, so we go here, and we would say that the linear model assumes that the profits are 2.2 times higher than if the tax rate was 25%. The logarithmic model assumes 3.7%, and the quadratic model 5.7%. If you go to a country with 1%, like Luxembourg, then you start seeing how this high nonlinearity actually matters a lot, because the linear model has an increase of only 2.6 times versus a logarithmic model with 29 times. And if you go a little lower to the case of Jersey, then it becomes really extreme, the difference. So this is our main methodological contribution in the paper. And what this implies when we look at the profits that are being shifted in and out of countries, those are in this figure. So we have different models. The two first are some estimates from the literature, and then we have the linear model, the quadratic model, the logarithmic model, which is our main model, and the misalignment model. And in blue, we have the countries that are the origin of those profits, and in red, we have the countries that are the destination of those profits. So where the profits have been shifted out to where profits have been shifted in. And well, one thing that is important is that all models basically give around 1 trillion of profits shifted out and 1 trillion of profits shifted in, because yeah, they should be the same. And the countries that lose the most are United States, Japan, Germany, France, South Korea, and Brazil in absolute terms. And the countries that receive those profits are Cayman Islands, Netherlands, Luxembourg, a little bit China, Hong Kong, Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Switzerland, and Singapore. Yeah. So this is our main result of the scale of profit shifting in the world. And then after looking at how much countries lose in terms of profits, we look at how much countries lose in terms of as a percentage of total tax revenue. And we do this for high income countries, upper middle income countries, lower middle income countries, and low income countries. And what we show in this plot is that while the gains are very small for all the groups, the losses are pretty high for lower middle income countries and low income countries, especially in the case of the misalignment model. This is the model where we only compare where the profits are, and we compare it to the location of employees and wages and sales. For the logarithmic model, there is not such a clear relationship, but also seems that lower middle countries may be losing more. And finally, I don't want to put even more tables, but we look at which companies are more aggressive, and we find that the most aggressive companies are the ones headquartered in the United States, Bermuda, Luxembourg, and Belgium, and the least aggressive are the ones headquartered in South Africa, Mexico, China, and India. There is a clear divide there between high-income countries and lower-income countries. And just to end up with some concluding remarks, so how much do countries lose is more than previously estimated. We estimated around 200 to 300 billions versus 100 to 150 billions that has been estimated before. Which tax havens are important, especially those with extremely low tax rates, like the Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands and the Jerseys. Those are actually really important, and those cannot be modeled with the linear models. Which countries lose the most? Low-income countries, relatively to tax revenues. And are US multinational corporations special? Yes, because they are the most aggressive ones in profit shifting. And this has some implications for global tax reform. Well, low-income countries lose the most, and they should be included on an equal footing in the negotiations. The second one is that a reform needs to affect havens with extremely low tax rates, and this gives them some support for the importance of a high global minimum tax rate. And the third one is that an unanimous support is unlikely going to be possible because of all these tax havens, basically. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Please prepare your questions, ask them in a chat, and in half an hour, it will be possible to have a discussion and ask all the speakers. Now, it's my pleasure that Professor Johannes Vogt accepted the invitation to present his research. He holds the chair of taxation and finance at the University of Mannheim, and he's going to present his research, which is titled, "Can European Banks Country-by-Country Reports Reveal Profit Shifting? An analysis of the information content of EU banks' disclosures." So Johannes, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks for having me. A great event and a very active community that now is active in the country-by-country reporting. It's great to see. I've just posted the link to the paper. We're still in the process of updating it, so there's going to be a new version soon. So I think just to follow up on the previous presentation, so idea of this paper is that there's still a great degree of uncertainty about the extent of profit shifting. There's been a traditional sort of way to approach this with microdata, where the finding was, yes, it's there, but it's not really huge. So I've just posted 2 papers that are sort of representative of this literature. Then more recently, there is sort of papers coming out saying, no, that can't be. It's a really big data problem. So when we use aggregate data, we estimate it's a much larger extent that is going on. And then Klausing had a paper using administrative data, which should also have a much more complete coverage, saying, you know, it's about 40% of US corporate income tax revenue, which is lost, which is a lot larger than the traditional sort of answer. But even the administrative data can have huge problems. So there's a paper by Blue and Robinson pointing out there's a huge double counting problem here, which makes the answer a lot smaller again. And that's where basically our paper picks up and says, well, there's now country by country reporting by, well, for a couple of years now, by European banks. And that is the comparative advantage of using this data set. We can compare what we've used before, what was sort of available information about banks, and we can compare that to the complete country coverage that European banks have to give in their country by country reports. And so what we want to point out in this paper is how large was this blind spot in order to figure out how big that missing data issue is once you take the complete coverage into account. And then, of course, similar to the previous paper, you could say we can then also try to give answers. What is the extent of profit shifting? Just to give you a couple of numbers. Oh yeah, so the main takeaway of the paper is that we really miss more than half of the information, and in particular the important stuff, as you'll see, the most profitable subsidiaries and so on. And then, of course, we can also give estimates for how large we think that the profit shifting problem is. And so our answer for, banks headquartered in the EU, what can we say about US revenue, tax revenue? We think that about 10% of the global profit is shifted. But there are a couple of countries for which the implied revenue loss is a lot larger, in particular the UK and France. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. There's, of course, a lot of work going on about the real effects of profit shifting. So there are lots of colleagues active in that area. Just to remind everyone, what is the information that is available, and what we think what makes this paper unique is that we've invested a lot of effort in meticulously collecting the whole population of country by country reports of banks. But it's still limited in the amount of variables which are available. And that limits what you can do with this data. So it's basically, so here I just have one report of a German Landesbank. And you get those 4 variables split up by countries. It's the revenue, it's profit loss in the jurisdictions, it's the tax they pay, and the only input production input for that firm, you could say, is the number of employees. There's no indication for the stock of capital or other inputs. So how large is that blind spot? In the green column, you see the total presences in let's say affiliates, you could say. I'm not using the word affiliate because we're counting countries, right? Not affiliates in that data. So how many countries on average are there when we look at country by country reporting? So you can compare these 2 columns. So we see that on average, we have just less than 13 countries in these reports. And in Orbis, which has the most extensive coverage, I hear some echo. Anyway, in Orbis, we only 5.4 countries when we add them up. We can also compare that only for the tax havens, which is the blue columns. And there we see that the relative gap is a lot larger. So in Orbis, we only see less than 1 tax haven presence and more than 2.5 in the country by country data. I should add, we condition on having financial information available here. So there may be some kind of addresses in Orbis. Orbis is really good with just collecting sort of letterboxes, so to say, but then knowing what that firm does and what it is a lot more difficult. So you can see already this sort of opaqueness is very strong, in particular for the tax haven presences. But so we miss more than half anyway, and it's even stronger for the tax havens. So let's think about the tax haven share in the total multinational enterprise here. So here, that's what we had on the previous picture here. That's the country presences. That's the number that we already had before. So when we think about the share that the tax haven makes up in the multinational enterprise, based on Orbis, which is the green column here, it's less than 13%. Once you take the total, the country by country reports into account, you see that this shoots up to 20%. So the tax havens, even if you just count the number of countries, they're a lot more present once you really have the full picture. The same, in particular, that's even more relevant for profits, which is, well, maybe not that surprising after all. The tax havens only make up 4% of the profits in Orbis, in what we had before. Once you look at the country by country reports, they make up close to 20%. So this increases about by a factor of 4, which is a lot. And then you can do the same exercise for employees. Their tax havens only make up 1.4% in the previously available data. And once you get the full picture, it's close to 5%. So here we have a factor 3. Well, for taxes, maybe not that surprising, there's nearly no increase in the taxes that are paid. It was 8.5% of all taxes paid by the M&E before, and now it's close to 10%. And then we can look, there's no capital in the, no stock of capital information in the data, the country by country data. So the only thing we can really do is look at profit per employee. And again, we can do the same exercise when we look at all countries. The profit per employee is larger when we get the full picture. With the limited picture that we had before, the profitability was a bit lower. How does that split up between tax havens and non-tax havens? We see that this increase, once we get the full picture, is of course particularly focused in tax havens. There we have an increase from the limited picture. We only see a profitability of 140,000 euros per employee, and that shoots up to above 200,000. When we look at tax havens, that increase is a lot milder. There the increase is only from 62,000 to 85,000. So what we see is that gap in productivity between tax havens and non-tax havens. Let's call it productivity for the moment, because we cannot be really sure that it is actually really profit shifting. It may just be that all the rich people are served in tax havens. Then it's not really clear that the bank is shifting profits. It could just be that someone else is shifting profits and the banks are just serving these people there. That would be another view on this, right? But we can see that with a full picture, this productivity gap gets a lot larger. And then we can split this up by country and compare the limited picture, which is the light green right bars on the right, with the full picture, which is this more blue bar. And then we see that in particular in tax havens, the productivity increases a lot. So for Cayman Islands and Malta, there wasn't even any information beforehand, and they have a huge reported productivity, if you want to call it profit per employee. and other countries actually do not gain that much. So it's in particular the tax havens and not so much the high tax countries for which productivity is a lot larger, the profit per employee numbers. And based on this, we can now estimate the magnitude of profit shifting. So we already sort of allow for higher productivity in some countries. So we just take productivity in the service sector, and that already gives tax havens some head start, because they, in aggregate numbers, they already have a higher productivity in the service sector. And then we multiply the number of employees with what is usually the productivity in that country, in the service sector, and that gives us, so when we split the overall profit of a multinational enterprise by these employee numbers times productivity, you get an expected profit. And then we compare that to the actually reported profit per employee. And based on that, we can make a calculation how large the profits are that are shifted, and which countries gain and which countries lose. And what we find is that banks shift about close to 10% of their global profits. And so it's 11.4 billion euro that EU headquartered banks in our sample shift. And then, as in the previous presentation, it's a very heterogeneous picture of who gains and who loses. So with our bank data, it's Hong Kong, which gains the most in absolute terms, but also quite a lot in relative terms. Another big winner in terms of relative gains would be the Cayman Islands, though in absolute terms it's not so relevant. What about other countries? Well, the countries that tend to lose the most in absolute terms as well as in relative terms would be here the United Kingdom and France. Some miles for Germany, for example, and for France. And then we can compare that to the prior literature, of course. How much time do I have left, Peter?
About 2 minutes.
2 minutes. So, of course, there are more fancy methods of estimating profit shifting, but there we just have to admit that we just don't have a stock of capital. So what we do at the end of the paper is that we try to link this to profit shifting regressions that account for the stock of capital in countries. What we find is that I think the quickest way to describe is that our analysis shows that previous estimates, which were based on the limited amount of data, should really be taken as sort of a lower bound estimate of the profit shifting that is going on. Because once you take the full picture into account, you get a much more negative coefficient estimate than before. The main problem with this is that we don't have the stock of capital, and when you estimate this, what you get is that you don't even find the expected coefficient anymore, in the sense that normally you expect the relationship, the higher the tax rate, the lower the reported profits. And that relationship is lost as soon as you leave out capital as a control variable. Still, we find that even if you have that omitted variable, that our coefficient estimates are still a lot more on the negative side, which points out that there is a lot of scope for bias in previous estimates, and why they should really be taken as a lower bound due to the missing data problem. So to conclude, I hope I could sort of make you curious about the paper as a whole.
Thank you, Johannes.
As said.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, across several countries. So we should really take a full picture that this is not just a sort of a minor problem that we don't have complete data. It is really sort of the elephant in the room. Thanks. And yeah, if you have any comments, please share them with me in the chat, or you can also write me an email so I can get back to you.
Thank you, Johannes. This has been an excellent presentation, and there's at least one question coming to you in the question and answer session in 15 or 20 minutes. So thank you very much. Exciting research. And let me now introduce the third and final speaker of the first session of our workshop. Let me introduce Sarah Godard, who is a PhD student at Charles University, and she's also affiliated with Berlin School of Economics and Law. Her presentation is going to be titled, "How much multinational corporations really pay in taxes and where? Evidence from the voluntarily published country-by-country reports." So Sarah, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I will try to share my slides. 1 second. I don't know what's going on. Sorry. Okay, can you see my slides now? Yes, okay, sorry for the delay. Yes, I'm going to present this paper, which I have written together with Oliver Barron, Tommaso Faccio, and Peter Jansky. And yes, as the title already says, we use data collected from voluntarily published country-by-country reports. So based on this data, we are trying to answer the following research questions. That's how much tax do multinational corporations pay and where? Is there evidence of aggressive tax planning? And do multinationals which voluntarily report their country-by-country, which voluntarily publish their country-by-country reports, pay higher effective tax rates compared to other multinational corporations? And do they report a lower share of profits in tax havens or a higher share? Because one might expect that if they voluntarily publish these reports, maybe they've got nothing to hide. So that was kind of the curiosity about this data that we had. Yes, so we manually collected reports from the company's website and transformed the data into a processable format when necessary. And for this version of the paper, we had 10 multinationals, so it's a small sample because not all of the multinationals are willing to publish their data, unfortunately. And yeah, so we have 10 multinationals, 5 from the extractive sector, 3 insurance from the insurance sector, 2 from the telecommunications, and they are active in about in 134 jurisdictions. So here you see the list of companies, Anglo-American, AXA, I will not read it all out. And we have data for the years 2017, 18, 19, but not all companies report on all years, and also not all companies report all the data we would have liked to use. So for our sample, we select only the observations were of positive profits, that we exclude those observations when a group reports only losses in a country. And we pool observations from different years. As I said, we have only, for some companies, we only have 2017, for others only 2018, but we still pool them together in our analysis. And when we have several years per company, then we use the average of the 2 or 3 years. And we set negative tax payments to 0. Okay, so just as a first impression about, here we see, like this is about the relative importance of tax havens, and we see that companies that voluntarily publish their CBCR are present in tax havens, but the share of the overall profit reported in tax havens varies significantly in between companies. So here in the first line, you see the share of profits reported in tax haven that we have computed based on the aggregate CBCR data by the OECD. So we use this as a comparative value to our sample. And in our sample, we find that on average, 16% of profits are reported in tax havens. But this masks important differences between the companies. So we have here 4 companies with quite high shares of profits in tax havens that are AXA, BT Group, NN, and Shell. And then we have 6 companies, actually the majority of companies, which report a significantly lower profit in tax havens, ranging from 1 to 7%. So the picture is quite mixed here. Okay, then in terms of methodology, we undertake 3 different steps to analyze our data. First, we compute effective tax rates by multinational group and by country. Then we look at misalignment of reported profits and location of economic activity by country. And we use the location of employees or the number of employees as a proxy of economic activity as our preferred measure, but we also tested for other measures of activity, such as turnover and tangible assets. And then finally, we estimate the semi-elasticity of reported profits with regard to effective tax rates. So I will now go through those 3 steps and present the results for each section. So the effective tax rates are calculated in this way. So for the we compute a global tax rate for each multinational group, which is basically the sum of income taxes accrued in all countries by the multinational group I, and then divided by the gross profit, by the sum of gross profits that the multinational group reports in all countries. So this would be the global effective tax rate of the multinational group. And then we do the same by country. So we divide the sum of all income tax accrued by country, and we divide it by the sum of gross profits reported in each country. Yeah, so for the effective tax rate by multinational group, we find that a majority of the multinational group has a effective tax rate above the OECD average. So here we see that Eni, Repsol, Shell, Anglo American, and Rio Tinto and Iberdrola are actually above 16%, and only Vodafone and AXA have an effective tax rate of 0 because they have actually reported negative taxes in many jurisdictions. Okay, this is an overview of ETR of the effective tax rates by country. We find a very strong variation of the average effective tax rate across countries. I will not go into detail on this graph because it contains a lot of information. I will just maybe draw your attention to the colored bars that represent our country like the effective tax rates we estimated by country, and they range from 0% here on the left side to about 80% on the right side. So on the zero part here, we find mostly the well-known tax havens, but also some surprising candidates. And on the right side, we find mostly resource-rich countries, such as Algeria, Libya, Nigeria. And this might be due to the fact that, we have many extractive companies in the sample, and these countries charge extra taxes on in the oil and gas industry, usually that come on top of the standard corporate tax rates. And the red dots are a similar ETR estimates based on the OECD data, just for comparison, because we know that our sample is very small, so the ETR are very sensitive to individual company results. Okay, but what we try to do with those ETR is actually that we want to see, okay, no, that's in the next section, sorry. Okay, then in the second step, we calculate the misalignment of profits and activity for each country. And this is similar to what was presented before. So the misaligned profit is actually the gross profit minus the share of economic activity multiplied by the total global gross profit. So we would say if a country reports a higher share of global profits than of activity, we would say this gives rise to excess profits. And if it reports a lower share of profits than would be justified by economic activity, then we say it leads to missing profits. And here we have plotted the effective tax rate and misalignment, trying to find a correlation between the two. So on the vertical axis, you see actually profit misalignment as a percent of profit in that country. And so here a positive, on the positive side, this would imply like that this country has actually more profits than what the number of employees would suggest. And here we find, of course, Bermuda, Bahamas, Malta, Singapore. So our results are quite similar to those in the previous presentation. But we also have many countries, like resource-rich countries, on the side of the excess profit countries. So here you see Norway, Nigeria, Algeria, and Australia, also on the side of excess profit countries. And a negative value of profit misalignment then would imply that the multinationals report more activity in those countries than profits. And on the horizontal axis, we have plotted the average effective tax rate, again ranging from 0 here on the left side to about 80 on the right-hand side. And we would say that at first sight, we don't really see a correlation here, or it's hard to guess or to assume a functional form here based on the scatter plot. But what we find is that most tax havens have very low effective tax rate and report and high excess profits. There's a mention in the chat. My time is over. No. That at the same time, the resource-rich countries or countries that have an important oil or gas industry also have high excess profits, but they only have actually high effective tax rates. So this might somehow disturb or blur our observed relationship of, or our expected relationship of a negative correlation between ETR and reported profits. And then here we have most of the, like on the lower part, we have most of the large Western European economies, but I think all East European economies and some or many developing economies that would be considered missing profit countries according to this approach. Okay, in order to formalize some of the correlations that we observe in the descriptive analysis, we also estimate a simple OLS regression, where we take the log profit of each multinational group in country J, and we regress it on the effective tax rate of country J. Then the employees of the group reported in country J, the tangible assets of the group reported in country J, and other control variables such as the GDP per capita in that country, and as a in order to somehow account for the effect of the extractive industries, we include a variable that represents the share of natural resource rent in GDP that's taken from the World Bank database. And we also include a dummy when the country is the headquarter, or when the country actually hosts the headquarter of the multinational group, because we know that the headquarter usually attracts more profits than the subsidiaries. And then we also include a multinational group dummy to somehow account for differences between the, unobserved differences between the companies. In addition, we compare the results for a linear relationship between the effective tax rates and the profits, and we also include a quadratic term here, as Javier mentioned before. The linear relationship might lead to an underestimation of the relationship. How much time? Okay. So here are the results, or like a short summary of the results. When we only include the linear, the tax rate in a linear form, then we don't find a significant relationship between the profits and the tax rate. But when we include the quadratic term, then we actually find the expected negative relationship, like a higher effective tax rate leads to lower reported profits in that country, but this only holds up to an effective tax rate of 34%. And then after 34%, this relationship turns into a positive relationship, which is a bit counterintuitive, but it might be explained by the big importance of the oil-rich countries in our sample. Okay, but qualitatively, these results are similar to other studies, or to what similar to what Javier mentioned before, that actually the effect is much more important for low tax countries than for average tax countries. So if there's a 4 percentage point difference in the effective tax rates between Bahamas and UK, this represents a much higher incentive to shift profits to the Bahamas than if we had a 4 percentage point tax difference between UK and Germany.
Thank you, Sarah. Probably let me interrupt you there. Not sure you've seen the messages about the time up. And let me open the discussion part of this workshop. So, and if there is time at the end of this discussion, it'd be good to go back to your conclusion. No worries. Let me step in now. So I'd like to invite Cassandra Abed, who introduced herself as a PhD student in development studies, and she has a question for Javier, and we'll probably collect a few questions, and then we will let the presenters to answer them, and then we'll collect another round of questions. I can see that we don't have the raise a hand feature, so you don't need to write up the full question into the chat, but if you can indicate there that you have a question, then that would be great. So now Cassandra, if you're with us, could you please pose your question?
Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for organizing today, and thank you, Javier, for your presentation. I was just wondering, it seems that the model is mostly based on the pull factor of these shifted profits on the basis of the corporate income tax rate. And I was thinking of some other studies that highlighted, for instance, the specific advantages that can be used by through tax treaties or capital deductions and so on. How do you think that this would interfere with some of your results, or are there any controls used?
Thank you, Cassandra. So, as I said, we'll take more questions, and then Javier will have the opportunity to get back to you. Another question was from Christoph Traubwetter, who's from Netzwerk Steuergerechtigkeit. So I think the tax justice NGO in Germany, the leading one. So Christoph, if you can pose your question now.
Hi everyone. Thanks for having the event. Just a very quick question to the whole round. We've been discussing that in the tax justice movement. We've always said 500 to 600 billion loss of profit shifting. Javier, now you and the state of tax justice say 200 to 300. So which number would you use? And where does the difference come from? And maybe just a very quick second question. Personally, I was browsing Orbis and I saw that Tencent and some other big Chinese companies seem to be as problematic, similarly structured to US peers. And you said China is non-aggressive. Do you think that applies also to the big Chinese companies, or that's just on average?
Thank you. Thank you, Christoph. We have another question from Frankie, who you will hear from in the second session of this workshop, but she now has a question. Frankie, if you can pose your question, please.
Thanks, Peter. So my question is for Johannes, although I'd be interested if Sarah has a take on it as well, which is, and I'm not sure if this is present as well in the voluntary disclosures, but in some of the banks' country-by-country reporting, it appears that there may be double counting in their revenues and profits, because it looks like when they pull their figures together, they're not taking account of consolidation adjustments. Some of the banks do appear to be doing this and others don't. So I was really interested in knowing how you're addressing that potential for double counting, and whether you found a way to identify where it is existing and strip it out.
Thank you. And I think that the final question in this round of questions will come from Manon Windgens. Apologies.
Yes, Manon Windgens. Thanks a lot, Peter. Yes, so my question was for Sarah. I saw that you had data for some of the multinational enterprises for just only for 1 year, and I was wondering how you tested that data, because you have only 1 year data for those multinationals. And that was my question. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And now I'd like to, let us stop here. Let's have the speakers speak again, and then we'll come back to more questions. So I'm not sure if, shall we go in the order of the presentations? So in that case, Javier, it will be your turn.
That's good. Yeah, thank you both Cassandra and Christoph for the questions. So start with the one from Cassandra. So you say that there may be other factors that are relevant, like tax treaties, and really agree with this. In our model, in our main model, in the logarithmic model, we do not include any of these things. However, we also use this other model, the misalignment model, which is basically similar to what Johannes presented. And what I was really surprised about is that both models give really similar results. And the misalignment model would take into consideration all other things that may be affecting this profit shifting, like tax treaties. So this makes me believe that tax treaties in the global, to understand the global magnitude of profit shifting, are not so relevant, maybe because most countries have some already. But I think they definitely would be relevant for some specific countries, especially developing countries. So I think this could be pretty interesting to test in the future. The second question was Christoph about the 500 to 600 billion figure. And the answer here is that that 500 to 600 billion figure includes indirect effects of profit shifting. So basically, this is the race to the bottom effect. A country decreases the tax rate, so all countries are kind of forced or seen to be forced to decrease the tax rate. So when you include these effects, which are the indirect effects, the estimates of profit shifting, the cost of profit shifting increases by 4 or 5 times. So if you look at those original papers, the direct cost of profit, the direct tax revenue losses that they estimate are around 100 to 130 billions, and the total cost are around 500 to 600 billions. If you would take the same ratio and you would apply it to our estimate, you would find total cost of over 1,000 billions, 1 trillion. Of course, this is highly hypothetical and depends how you define and do you include the losses in the domestic economy or only foreign companies. So there you get a lot of assumptions and you can get any number you want, basically. But yeah, so these 200 to 300 billions are actually higher than anything else in the literature. And it's only when you include these indirect effects that you get to these 500 to 600 billions. The second question was about China. Yeah, so when I said is more aggressive, I should have used that word, is that the coefficient in the log term is higher, which this means is that they shift profits to, so if a higher coefficient means that you shift profits to countries with a lower tax rate. So this effect is not there for China. China does not shift profits to countries with a 0% tax rate, according to the CBCR data. That doesn't mean they don't shift profits. I think Chinese companies are actually extremely aggressive and profit shifting. It could be the case that they would be shifting profits back to China. I'm not sure how the Chinese companies work. Maybe some of you have a much better idea of why this can be happening. But yeah, thank you for both your questions.
Thank you, Javier. Johannes, if you can take the floor, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Frankie, for the question. The unfortunate thing is that most banks don't give any information on how they assign profits to countries, in particular what they do with dividends. There are few banks which try to give you at least an impression on if there are differences to consolidated profits, if you add up the country profits, how you can account for them. But this is so few information that at least in that year, it's sort of impossible to take into account. My speculation would be that there's not that much dividend income in the tax havens. I would speculate it's rather interest income or other passive income that you would have, and dividends are, at least in the tax haven, not so much of an issue. I would think it matters the most for the headquarter country. That would be my speculation, that we may overestimate the profitability in the headquarter country. So in that sense, and when the headquarter country is a high tax country, you may be underestimating a bit profit shifting in that respect. That would be my speculation. But with the information that the banks give, it's yeah, they would have to be forced to use the same method and give information which one they actually used. Yeah.
Thank you, Johannes. And let me move from Mannheim to Berlin. Sarah, the floor is yours now.
Yes, I got the question about the regression, and yes, it's true that there's only, like, it's pooled, and for most of the multinational groups, we have only 1 year. So we wouldn't say that we establish a causal effect of the effective tax rate on the reported profits, but we rather use this regression to have a more a better analysis of the underlying correlations, so we can clear out the effect of the number of employees and capital and of the resource, like the share of extractives in the economy. And then we actually find that there is a correlation between the effective tax rate and the reported profits, and it's actually negative for most of the countries. So it's it just confirms our initial expectations that there is a negative correlation between effective tax rates and profits, even though we find that, which I couldn't say in the end, that it's much lower than in most of the other studies. Like, the effect is much weaker for our data. Or I shouldn't say effect, the relationship is much weaker.
Thank you. And thank you for being careful with your language. And now let me, encourage everybody who's still thinking about asking that question to, just to let briefly know that, you want to ask a question, because we have only one person so far waiting in line, and that person is Nesani Cheseide. Apologies again for reading the name, but please, Nessa, if you're with us, if you can pose the question.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the fantastic presentations. This is a question for Javier. I'm just kind of gathering that I'm a PhD student studying Ireland's corporate tax regime. And from your presentation, it seems like Ireland is coming out as somewhat less aggressive than in some of your previous publications. I'm wondering, is that the correct understanding? And also, is there scope from this work to build on some of the previous work that you've done around looking at actual business practices in relation to aggressive behavior? So, for example, if Ireland is coming out less aggressive than the zero tax haven jurisdictions, is there scope for looking at its role as a kind of stepping stone in relation to those other havens? I'm thinking also of the difficulty of measuring certain cross-border transactions, like the double Irish structure would still have been in place at the time of you looking at the time this data covers.
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you. And I'm always asking these questions to Javier too. But I can also see in the audience Ron Davis. So in case the answers from Javier, which I can't imagine will be unsatisfactory, you can jump in with your comments. Thank you, Javier.
Yeah, my answer to that question would be that the CBCR data is actually not really good for the case of Ireland. So the reason why this happens is that we completely disregard stateless income entities. And we do this because there is some double counting of the data. So by doing this, we reduce the double counting. For the US data, you reduce it from like 20% to something like I think like 14%, if I remember correctly. But the problem with doing this is that stateless companies, exactly the ones that are important for the case of Ireland. The case of Apple and the double Irish would count as stateless entities, not as Irish profits. So in that sense, yeah, I think Ireland is the main example that we actually would underestimate the importance. The problem, if we include all stateless entities, is, well, it's two. One of them, we actually don't know if it's actually Irish or other kinds of mismatches. Another one is that some other tax transparent companies would also be included when there's actually nothing wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we decided to be more conservative and completely exclude them, but this has that effect. And regarding the other question you had about understanding the practices of Ireland, I think that would be, yeah, really interesting. I think this in this plot I showed looking at the profits of profit-making affiliates versus the profits that have been offset. You saw that Ireland was in the bottom part of it, which means that companies in Ireland usually make profits. So that could be a little surprising for these double IDs and those other structures that were in place in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think it has to do with these stateless entities, and it would be really interesting to actually investigate more about this.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you both for excellent exchange. And I can see that Sarah wants to ask a question. And if anybody wants to join the conversation with a comment or question, we have, I think, 8 minutes until the end of the first session. So you still have the opportunity to do so. Sarah, please.
Yes, I found it very interesting that Javier also identified China as one of the most important excess profit countries, because we had a similar observation when we analyzed the German multinationals in a different paper. And at first I thought, okay, maybe we just misidentified China as an excess profit country because workers are so productive in China, or they have cheap capital and cheap labor, maybe, so they are above, very productive, above the world average, and that's why we identify them as excess profit countries. But maybe it's also true, or maybe the hypothesis you mentioned is true, that they do profit, like the Chinese corporations shift profits, but they actually shift them back to China. So maybe that's part of the mystery. Yeah. So thank you for that.
I would also like to hear Johannes' view on this, because I also saw it in his paper that they were more profitable. I think what could be important to remember is that a lot of these multinationals in China are state-owned. So the incentives of profit shifting for a Chinese company will be different from the incentives of, let's say, an American company. I haven't looked into what this would imply in the data, but I think it's really interesting to look at the Chinese companies in particular.
Thank you, Javier. And Johannes, please.
Or just based on banks, I just wanted to point out that Hong Kong was the biggest gainer in our data, which is now China, I guess. Well, I guess I shouldn't say anything about that.
Thank you. And Irma, do you want to pose that question?
No, actually it was a comment, because we work on an article on a book chapter for the Belt Road Initiative, and we look at why China is participating at the same time in BEPS, at the same time at the UN, and at the same time in the Belt Road Initiative. And one of the reasons what we find there for BEPS was that they have a lot of problems with transfer pricing and the lack of comparables. And the reason is because the companies will not give the information. And just because of that transfer pricing, they decided to go for BEPS. But at the same time, parallel to that, they are building this kind of network with the Belt Road Initiative and this framework. And that could be something that is interesting to look also in the future. But Mohammed has a question, I guess.
All right, I'm happy to have the question, Mohammed. I can't see it anywhere, but if that's the case, please speak.
Hi, thank you so much for your great presentations. I would like to ask a question from Sarah. I'm just curious why you didn't use effective tax rate for industries in your regression, which you presented in slide number 2. Because, you know, if you just have a look at different tax rate, different industries are paying, for example, in the United States, you can find that there's quite difference between the rate they are paying. So why didn't you use effective tax rate for industry for each enterprise?
Yes, I will answer directly. It's a good point. I think when we get more data, and hopefully we will get more voluntary reports published, then I think it would make sense to do it. I think at the current state, we only have so few observations that the effective tax rates are very volatile already. So if we then split the sample even in smaller subgroups, I'm not sure if the effective tax rate would be so informative. But maybe it's something we could try, yes.
Thank you, Sarah. And, you know, maybe the companies, more companies likely will publish their data voluntarily, but maybe, you know, it will be the government, in the most likely case, the European Union, making the companies the companies making their reports public, as is being discussed these days. And, you know, after the voting in the European Council, this is a hot topic between European Parliament, European Commission, and European Council. Let me, you know, I'd like to give the floor to the final word to the first speakers. You know, if you want to make a few observations and, you know, 2 sentences or so. And with that, we will close this first session of the workshop. So, Javier, if you want to start.
Thank you, Peter, for putting me on the spot. Yeah, I mean, not really. I mean, I think this data, the CBCR data, is super interesting. I think there's a lot of work to be done on the data and to improvements, and this has to do partly with the double counting, but also partly with the disclosure, having countries like the Netherlands disclose on their multinationals, or yeah, every other country, Germany, UK. Yeah, and I'm looking forward for the next years. I think it's going to be super interesting research.
Thank you. And, you know, you've done very well. And, you know, if you want to add a couple of sentences, Johannes, as a final word. Good.
As a what? Sorry, you're muted.
A final word from you in this session.
Oh, no, well, just a big thank you for all the comments and the active participation. It's been great joy.
Thank you, Johannes. It's, you know, a pleasure to have you. And Sarah, I'm not sure if you want to, you know, leave us with some final words, maybe from your final slide that you did not manage to include in your original presentation.
Yeah, well, I just said that we found it interesting that we didn't find really clear differences between those multinationals that voluntarily publish and those that don't, that are only in the OECD aggregate data. So yeah, maybe we will improve this result when we get more data. But at the moment, we cannot say that those that voluntarily publish are more tax honest or something like that. So we're also looking forward to getting more data.
Excellent, thank you, Sarah. And so with this, you know, I'd like to say a few things before we have the break. So, I appreciate the presenters and the active participation from all of you. Thank you for tuning in on this workshop on country-by-country reporting. We'll be continuing in 15 minutes.
Welcome, everyone. We are going to start the second session, the second panel. And we also have, you have already looked at the whole perspective from the economics and the numbers. And now we are going to look at more legal perspective, but we are also linking the country-by-country reporting to sustainable development. And one of the questions that we wanted to address also in this workshop, and that's the reason why we thought it was very interesting also to cooperate with CORPTAX and all the work, fantastic work that Petre has done with his team, is about, we are talking about the same thing, country-by-country reporting. We look at the numbers, we look at the countries, we look at the data, we look at the confidentiality, we look at all the legal instruments and implementation and the BEPS. And the question is, and in addition to that, we also have the EU developments. And currently, this could not be more a hot topic than what it is right now. And it is, and we're still talking about the same type of country-by-country reporting, and it's the data that is going to be, because of the public country-by-country reporting, useful, and also whether how this data could also help us to achieve or to show what the companies are doing, the multinationals, regarding the sustainability. And there have been already some initiatives from the Global Reporting Initiative, for instance, where tax advisors and at the same time some business councils have decided to have a look at this country-by-country reporting and the sustainability. At the same time, there is also a lot of work being done now by the EU scholars, but also we look at now the accounting perspective from the public country-by-country reporting, and we look at also the tax perspective. So we are going to have a panel today. This second session will be a panel that is a little combined. And the question is how we can use this data, what is the value of the data, what we need, type of data we need to have sustainability, how we can align this data. And we will have first a short presentation by Dana. Dana is, I would say, Dana Nerudova, and she's a rector at University of Mendel University in the Czech Republic. And then after we will have Saila. And Saila is a PhD fellow at the Copenhagen Business School. You already heard she asked a question before. And then we will have Frankie Hackett. She is a policy leader at the European fellow at the European University Institute. And then thereafter we will have Frederick Heymüller, who is a PhD in the GLOBTAXGOV project. And we'll finalize with a nice experience, since we are also dealing with the Czech Republic, on the country-by-country reporting in the Czech Republic, a short remark. So I would say, without, please feel free to ask the questions in the chat, to exchange ideas, to introduce yourself, your research, what you are doing. Try to make it a little as interactive as possible, because I know asking an afternoon from you guys is a lot, especially if it's online. So try to make it, if you have any questions, you have any discussions, please feel free to do it, and we will try to make it as live as possible. So Dana, I will give the word to you, and the slides will be shared by Juliana Cubillos, who is also a PhD.
So thank you very much, Irma. As Irma mentioned, I was asked to give a broader presentation on the sustainability and the economic model. So my presentation, even though that I'm going to talk about a tax sustainability and tax sustainability index, which is very analytical, I'm trying to give a broader overview, because this fight with aggressive tax planning and the effort to limit profit shifting is, of course, the essential part of sustainability of the taxation systems. So can I ask for moving the slide? Thank you. I think that even though we are living in the pandemic, it's a great opportunity for all of us, because maybe we are living on the edge of changing the paradigm in economics. Because so far, our society is based on the fixation on GDP growth, and this fixation on GDP growth is reflected in the taxation policy which we are sticking for last 4 years at least, and this is a taxing for growth. This is the current economic model which our society is applying. But the crisis showed us that maybe we will have to move from taxing for growth to taxing for sustainable growth, because maybe we are going to start to talk about sustainable growth, not about just pure growth, because fixation on a cheap labor power caused, for example, in the spring, that we have moved some production of strategic products into China and India, and there have been critically lacking in our fight with pandemic. Therefore, maybe our societies start to also follow different aims, as for example, security or sustainability, because we are all living on the same planet. So therefore, we are suggesting that we should move from taxing for growth policy to taxing for sustainable growth policy. And we should move to a sustainable economic model, which means not only the fixation on GDP growth, but also looking at security and sustainability. Can I ask for another slide? Thank you. Looking on the current taxation system which are applied in Europe, there can be identified as sustainability gaps. You can see the 5 sustainability gaps we have identified. First, high and increasing weight of labor taxes in taxation mix of countries, decreasing importance of Pigovian taxes, intense tax competition including profit shifting. This is what we do understand as a sustainability gap in the taxation system. Tax compliance and tax fraud, again, very much connected with profit shifting and aggressive tax planning. And the last one, increasing of progressiveness of tax systems. So those are 5 main sustainability gaps we have identified in taxation policies and taxation systems throughout the EU. So therefore, in our research, we propose a general concept of tax system sustainability, and we have developed a model for evaluation and for measurement of sustainability of the taxation system. It has been quite complex because, as you will see on the next slide, there is a lack of literature. Could you please push enter just to roll all? Thank you. Because there is only literature which is focusing on concept of sustainability, on the basic principles, on the concept of intergenerational equity. There is also literature which is focusing on multidimensional view of sustainability. The first paper was by Brundtland, and we are building in our definition on that paper. But there is no literature on tax system sustainability. So what we did, and can I ask for, thank you. What we did, we just we have been building on the basic definition, taking into account all pillars which have been covered by the Brundtland report, but we enlarged the model by the 4th pillar, because Brundtland is talking about the environmental, social, and economic sustainability. And we enlarged that model by the 4th pillar, and we are talking about institutional sustainability. Can you please move on? Thank you. And this is the definition of the concept we came with. Therefore, we just, as the baseline was the Brundtland definition of sustainability. So we define tax sustainable system as tax system which is comprising a tax tools and tax related legislative measures which do contribute in sufficient extent to sustainability of economic, that's the first pillar, social, second pillar, environmental, third, and the last, institutional dimensions or pillars. And such system supports meeting the needs of present generation without compromising the needs of the future generation. So that's the basic idea. It's based on intergenerational equity. And you can see the scheme that the institutional pillar have a slightly different position as economic, environmental and social. Why? Because we do think that the institutional pillar is like an umbrella. That's the thing Irma's group is dealing with. That's the legal framework of the countries. That's the institutions in the countries. And without this institutional sustainability, it's not possible to achieve economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, social sustainability, and it's not possible to achieve sustainability of the taxation system. So for us, the crucial pillar is the institutional sustainability of policies which are implemented by the countries. So just to have a really small, tiny words about the model, how it works, we have published a technical paper in the European Journal of Operational Research, where you can find like the intestines of the models. It's very technical. I'm not going to talk about, but I'm going to give you a brief overview of how it works. It has a different modules, as you can see, the diamond, different pillars. Within each pillar, we have identified policy areas which are very much connected with the aim of the policymakers. For example, in the economic area, green growth. And then we have identified tax system tools which can be provided by the taxation system in order to achieve this policy area. And then in the third step, we have been asking the questions and we have been evaluating that. We had a binary questions, we had a numerical questions and everything like this. Therefore, based on this, we have identified 3 levels of sustainability. We have identified sustainability, strong sustainability, and we have also identified the level when the area is unsustainable, the dimension. The definition of policy areas and this building on policy areas allows to use the model for the policy makers like for 50 years, because the only thing you need to do is to change the policy area. And again, you can use the model again. And also this model allows policymakers to see the areas, the policy areas in which their policies are unsustainable. And if of course, it gives the food for policymakers to fix it. So this is the example of the Czech Republic. You can see that we are strongly sustainable in the social pillar, and you can see that we are, for example, not so good in environmental pillars. So this is what allows policymakers to think about where they are weak in sustainable policies. And we also did this for other EU countries. So, and the paper should be published fast. So can I switch? Yes. Yeah. So this is just the description how to interpret diamond. This graph you have seen. The result is that the taxation of the taxation system of the Czech Republic is sustainable, but as I said, we have a deficient contribution of environmental dimension. And we have identified critical policy areas as climate change, green innovation, and renewable energy and recycling. What does it mean? That there are no tax tools in taxation system to reach, for example, or to mitigate climate change or to increase green innovations and so on. So this was generally all from my side. And I hope that we are going to have a very nice discussion about how this sustainability concept fits into the things which Irma's group is currently doing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dana. And we will go now to Sila with a fantastic title, Transparency Just for Show. And so we will keep it in mind, this item of sustainability. Also bear in mind also these presentations, and we will finalize also with Dana with some short presentation on the Czech Republic. But let's hear first Saila. She also, well, of course, is a paper with Petr, who is a Marek Sedivi. And Saila, please.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you so much for the organizers for putting this workshop together. It's yeah, great to hear so many good presentations on this important topic. So our paper is about transparency sometimes seeming better than it maybe is. So it can maybe seem that country by country reporting and other types of transparency can be a great fix for many problems, but we have to actually dig down and see in practice how useful is it really, and how much does it actually address the problems. So we know that if you have transparency with country by country reporting from multinational corporations, the idea is that, first of all, there will maybe be some self-regulation, like Sarah's presentation talked about, that maybe these self-reporting companies will be paying higher taxes, that sunshine is the best disinfectant. So if everyone publishes where they pay tax, maybe they will be less aggressive. It also enables researchers to identify problem jurisdictions and companies. It also enables researchers to do research and publish papers, which is what we like to do. So there's also a bias there for researchers to always like data, and this is another motivation for transparency, right? Importantly, activists and regulators might also be able to identify tax abuse. This is, of course, the most important idea for country by country reporting. The problems with country by country reporting, we also do have to address, right? So there might be problems with the completeness of data. There are very large problems with the publication of data because it's sometimes reported but not publicly available, and sometimes not even available to all regulators that it might be relevant for. The correctness of data is of course also a concern. What we are addressing in this paper is problems with regard to compatibility with other sources. So all of these other problems of CBCR is something that can be is already addressed elsewhere, I think, but the compatibility with other sources is actually also super important. What we look at is the mining industry, and the question is, if we have this CBCR data and it says for a company that in one country, in 1 year, they paid a very low amount of tax, does that mean that we should raise the alarm and say, wow, they've been super aggressive, they didn't pay taxes even though they had a mine, for example? Or was it maybe because that year they were only digging in the mine and they didn't actually find any gold? So in other more general terms, is it that, oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong slide. Is it that no value was created there if there was a low amount of tax that was paid? Or is it that value was created, but it was extracted so that it was transferred to tax havens? Or is it that value was created, but was not taxed and was kept within the country, but was not taxed because of, for example, a tax incentive? Let me go back for a second. So So CBCR adoption has been actually on the book for almost 2 decades now. And in the extractives industry, there was already the transparency initiative, EITI, which is where extractive companies and governments publish what tax has been paid in each country. And since 2013, it's also been a legal standard in the extractive and logging sector for in the EU and Canada, and for a while the US until the Trump administration. Since 2014 and 2017, as you're all aware, probably there has been also the standard for other sectors. But when you look at what is actually required to disclose, it's very, very different. So what you are required to do in the extractive sector is very limited relative to, for example, the OECD data, or even just the financial data, financial sector data, because it was the first sector to do this, and then they didn't have already developed a comprehensive standard. So it's really just what tax that you pay. But as I said before, that can mean, if you just know the number of what tax you paid, that can mean a number of things. It doesn't necessarily give you any indication of tax abuse. So we need to have the revenue data. So in principle, we could find that from the annual reports. However, we should also know the tax rate. And in the mining industry, that's not so straightforward, because it's not just necessarily the statutory tax rate, because it's usually negotiated between the firm and the government in a contract. So we also need transparency for contracts, as well as, of course, revenue data. We do have some transparency for all of these things. So we thought, let's combine all of it and see if we can detect whether or not there's tax abuse going on in the extractive sector. So we collect the tax payments from the CBCR data. We look at over 100 contracts, and we look at annual reports, which are available from, for example, sources like Orbis. And first of all, it's important to stress that mining contracts, they are very much about tax. It's really insane how many tax incentives are given on a company by company basis, in which the government lowers the corporate tax rate, or lowers royalties, or gives other types of concessions which are favorable relative to the law. So looking at the contracts, we can see that almost all of the contracts give some incentive, and many of them, that's the blue bars in this chart, give incentives directly on the corporate income tax rate. So over 80% of all of the countries that we look at give incentives, at least one incentive in each contract. Here you can see the different categories of incentives. So you can see that the second highest is corporate income tax rate, CIT, that almost 50% of contracts we looked at has given a lower corporate income tax rate than we would have found just in law. And even more so, they give tax stability agreements, which means they basically promise the company that they cannot raise taxes. In one case I saw, this was valid for 99 years. So if you think about how often there's an election and a government may change, it's really far beyond what current voters can give permission to, and a current government. It's standard for these contracts to do it for 25 years. So we look at the overlap to find out, okay, so we know that there's a different regime in contracts. So can we then see what tax was paid, and are they on top of already getting this favorable regime? Are they maybe also still extracting value through profit shifting, etc.? Well, we have no idea, because the overlap, unfortunately, between these three sources is incredibly low. Just the overlap between tax payments and contracts is actually less than 10%. So we cannot really know at all what these tax payments actually mean if we don't know what they were supposed to pay in terms of their contract. So for all three of the sources, we actually only find 3 companies that overlap, where we can actually find both their annual reports, their contract, and information on their tax payments. And this is from over 100 contracts. So is transparency maybe just for show? At least we can say that tax payment data is not very useful in itself to detect tax avoidance. We can hope that the disclosure induces some self-policing, but if we don't have access to all of these sources, then in principle you could have a situation where everyone can say that there's transparency, but because there's no compatibility, you actually don't have accountability. So in conclusion, this standard is way too simple. It may have been a front runner, but it's now like going way behind. A new country by country or project by project standard has to go beyond just the payment and include also the legal framework and the revenue. This was my take on contributing to to this discussion. I know that you probably have also different ideas of what the value of country by country reporting data can be. This was a quite critical take, but of course criticism is only hopefully leading to an improved standard.
Yes, thank you, Saila. And actually, I think that that's the idea also of the workshop, to see all different views and to present the different ways that we can see the country by country reporting. One of the things that is interesting, so we started with the sustainability index, and we gave an introduction trying to see how we can also perhaps use this in the country by country reporting and to design a tax that is sustainable growth, like Dana was mentioning. And now we have Saila that was mentioning whether the transparency based on the extractive industry is just for show and how we can use this data. And now we have Frankie, and Frankie is positive because Frankie says, despite the fact that we cannot do so much, there are still benefits on the use of the data. So Frankie, positive side, please let us know. Thank you so much. You are mute. You are still positively mute. Yeah. Can I?
Thank you. Sorry, it took me a little while to find the unmute button after sharing my screen. Thank you very much, Irma. Yes, I am going to speak to specifically the CRD4 requirements on European banks and how there have actually been benefits despite the many drawbacks of that data, which we've already seen. So the structure of my presentation today is, as you can see here, we'll be spending the majority of the time talking about the benefits that have been realised through the publication of CBCR data under CRD4 and looking particularly at whether and how that standard has been a force for emancipatory accounting. I think it's perhaps better to look at CRD4 as one step in a general trend than it is to look as an end in itself. So accounting as a profession and corporate reporting practices both rest their legitimacy on concepts of the public or common good. And emancipatory accounting is accounting which recognizes that traditional forms of accounting have alienated and disenfranchised some who should be considered users of financial information, particularly about companies, and attempts to redress that. So the purpose of accounting information like that produced under CRD4 is to build confidence or trust. And trust and emancipation have this mutually reinforcing role where emancipation relies on trust and being able to trust relies on people being emancipated or empowered. So in this space, trust is the opposite of any kind of alienation, because trust is a mechanism which allows us to free up other actors to act without exercising control, or it allows us to be in a space where other actors who we don't have control over can act without us having to expend a lot of resource to try and gain that control. Within accountability functions, though, trust relies on honest information to avoid the production of trust facades, which means that trust requires two things. It requires the existence of a trustworthy reality and a communication of that trustworthy reality to those who need to rely on it. So this presentation is very much focused on the purpose of this kind of disclosure and how it relates to trust. And the publication of the kind of financial information we get under CRD4 is like the publication of all other kinds of accounting information. It's an exercise in knowledge creation. So it can be used to replicate existing power structures or to achieve regressive. And that's what we see, I think, in the last presentation, a lot of this not terribly transparent transparency. There is an alternative, though. It can reveal behavior which undermines trust, which can create pressures which drive progressive transformation. And emancipatory accounting is pushing for the production of information much more in these green boxes here, especially the dark green box. But it views the trustworthy facade we get as the usual output of most normal traditional accounting processes. And CRD4, this country-by-country bank reporting publication, arose out of explicitly emancipatory demands that more stakeholders be considered and that behaviours like corruption and tax avoidance be addressed. So the paper that I'm writing with Petter here considers whether it's had an emancipatory effect on trust, and we conclude that despite some problems, the CRD4 country-by-country reporting disclosure requirements have delivered a number of progressive benefits. I'm not going to spend very long here talking about the limitations of the standard. Others have already addressed them. There's a very good literature speaking about that, but there are problems, both with the consistency and quality of the data under this standard, and frankly with its existence. Some banks are just not publishing when they should be. And those problems arise from a lack of specificity in the regulation and a lack of enforcement. And within the context of emancipatory accounting terms, M&Es have far too much discretion under this standard. So the ability to create a trust facade or just a cloud of obfuscation that means you can't understand what they're doing is still really high. So I'm now going to turn to the meat of the presentation, which says that despite all of those very significant flaws, the standard has still delivered a number of benefits, which means it's provided at least some of its emancipatory potential. And these benefits particularly appear if you consider the requirement under CRD4 in the light of a pilot, so a smaller scale version of a large scale product which is designed to help us test the water and design a high quality ultimate solution, rather than itself, as I said previously, being a final step in any particular direction. So there are 5 pilot benefits which become apparent when we look at the bank's country-by-country reporting requirement in this way. First of all, that it's provided some good evidence of bank behaviour on tax avoidance, which expands the information available conversation, and it promises well for wider application of such standards. Secondly, that it's proven that many of the potential costs of country-by-country reporting, which have been raised as objections by opponents, don't actually crystallise when a standard like this is implemented. Thirdly, that the poor quality of the standard itself has highlighted some avoidable risks, so that makes it easier to deliver higher quality standards in the future. That it has shown us how to move towards greater trust in multinational enterprises, and that it may also be leading to some reduction in tax avoidance, which is, of course, the ultimate goal of these standards. So there is some limited evidence that it may have begun to be effective. So firstly, we're going to talk to the provision of evidence. Until the arrival of CRD4, we were using very limited proxies to assess multinational tax avoidance. And this has led to widespread disagreement about whether tax avoidance is real or not. The CBCR data under CRD4 has enabled the development of some much better proxies, which allows us to construct a stronger picture of the reality of tax avoidance by European banks, some of which we've already seen here today. I'm not going to go through it at length, but so for Overesch and Wolf, for example, banks with higher exposure in tax havens see a bigger increase in effective tax rates than those who had less activity in those locations due to their responses after the introduction of CRD4, which indicates a response to the disclosure, so it's suggestive of pre-existing tax avoidance. Yoshi, Outsley and Pearson don't find the same effect, but they do find an impact on income. And I don't really need to talk too much about what Dutt et al. Have been finding in their various papers, because Professor Fulgert's already spoken about this today. And other researchers have consistently found evidence of mismatched profits, revenues and activities using this data, which enables us to say with some confidence now that there is reasonable evidence of tax avoidance which becomes visible through the CBCR data. And this stronger cross-national picture of the existence and harms of tax avoidance enables transnational actors, often from civil society, to shift the balance of power in accounting developments away from the picture that banks themselves paint and towards a form of capitalism which is more cognizant of social democracy and social justice. And it also enables our academic conversation to move forward away from disagreeing about whether profit shifting and the use of tax havens exists to whether something should be done, and if so, what is that something? The second benefit has been the evidence it's provided about unrealized costs, and there are a number of costs which opponents of CBCR have used to argue that this kind of reporting, particularly this kind of reporting in public, will do more harm than good. Among these are the four you can see here: compliance costs, disclosure costs, the risks of over-audit, and the risks of actually increasing tax avoidance. And one benefit of the requirement is that by piloting CBCR on a small and financially secure section of the market in European banks, we have been able to demonstrate that those risks haven't crystallized. So we know now that we can go further in implementation without worrying so much about those costs. So first of all, compliance. Both the MNEs themselves and researchers like Oates and Tuck or Cockfield and MacArthur describe the risks that MNEs will have to pay significant infrastructure costs to access the information required by CBCR. And Hanlon, for example, gives estimates from interviews with multinationals, which range from hundreds of thousands to $3 to $5 million. It's clear, though, from the CRD4 regulations that those costs aren't prohibitive. Firstly, as Cockfield and MacArthur point out, most MNEs already did have access to this information because they needed to fill out their local tax returns. And secondly, because for companies of this size, even 3 to 5 million is within a threshold of a rounding error in the accounts, and because most of these corporations are already investing heavily in modernizing their internal reporting technologies, the costs associated with CBCR haven't appeared to be anything like having a material impact on the banks. And we can probably feel confident on that basis that they won't be prohibitive for other MNEs. And especially that's true now that all firms already have to have this infrastructure in place to comply with the OECD's private reporting requirements under BEPS Action 13. So the second putative cost is the disclosure cost. And Cockfield and MacArthur summarise these as the costs to businesses if their CBCR reveals commercially sensitive information. So the example given is the existence of unusually high margin markets. No evidence has so far arisen of any banks suffering any infringement of commercial confidentiality as a result of these disclosures, although that is, I think, potentially an interesting area for future research. It is, though, hard to imagine how data showing revenues, profits, employee numbers and taxes paid per country 9 months or more after the end of the relevant reporting period could put any commercially sensitive information about MNE activity into the public domain. It might reveal particularly good markets, but the existence of these markets isn't proprietary information subject to commercial confidentiality. So this cost, again, feels like it may have been overstated prior to the introduction of these requirements. Further, multinational enterprises have historically expressed concerns that corrupt or incompetent governments might use this kind of data to improperly or fraudulently attempt to claim more tax income than they're legally entitled to. We're not aware of any examples of this so far, and it will be interesting to see if the OECD's review of BEPS Action 13 disclosures reveals any such over-audit. On the other hand, we do have quite a lot of evidence that while companies aren't really being seen as soft targets for additional revenue extraction, they are, many of them, systematically abusing transnational tax law, seeing that there's a very low risk of detection, so they can treat transgression as an acceptable business risk. So far from being over-audited, we see that MNEs in many jurisdictions are under-audited by revenue authorities, who often face a significant lack of resource. Firms, as much as the rest of us, benefit from stable, well-regulated states with predictable common standards, if only because they reduce the risk of costly reputational battles. So the fear here in the market should really be about not the over-audit of good behaviour, but the under-audit of poor behaviour. And CBCR helps us to tip the scales away from the under-audit that currently exists. And the final positive cost is that making tax avoidance visible through CBCR reporting is supposed to act as a guide and encourage much more of it, much as we saw Harvey McLean and Price's work demonstrated that this the same thing happened with accelerating executive pay. As executives saw how much other executives were paid, they demanded ever increasing remuneration. Fortunately, the evidence we've seen above indicates that the pressures against tax avoidance from greater transparency seem to be more powerful than those which would incline MNEs towards greater avoidance. So as tax avoidance seems to be to some extent on the decrease, especially where other measures have been combined with transparency, it looks like that fear is not well grounded. We will likely need to be on the lookout for this in the future because MNEs might adopt divergent strategies, finding that if they can't compete effectively with good behaviour, they might maximise the effectiveness of tax avoidant behaviour. But fortunately, if we have the CBCR data, it should make those strategies more visible, which will help with enforcement. Another concern about tax transparency requirements.
Frankie, you have 2 minutes to finalize.
Oh, thank you. I will go much faster. Sorry. So another benefit is that it could lead to misleading data, and we have seen that there are problems with the data. The benefit is, having drawn up such a poorly effective standard, we could move to a much better standard, which gives us examples we can learn from. We've also seen some best practice developing, for example, within HSBC, as a result of the flexibility of this standard. So we should now be better placed to develop better standards. And finally, although we haven't been able to deliver trust here, we have seen the right direction for delivering trust. So we've seen that the banks are engaging in poor behaviour, and so we know that the best way to deliver trust is for them to engage in better behaviour. And if they do that, with the combination of that and further information, we can have a higher level of trust. And again, that's the final benefit we've seen, which is the indication that it is leading to a decrease in tax avoidance overall. So I don't want to appear overly utopian. We are, of course, a long way yet from a form of CBCR which will have a significant impact on global tax avoidance. But the requirements that we've had so far have helped us move in that direction by showing us the route to take and helping us to feel confident that in combination with other measures, CBCR is a good tool. So the pilot has had this emancipatory impact by challenging regressive narratives around tax transparency and the predicted costs which seek to preserve the exclusion of wider publics from the knowledge they need to challenge exploitative and alienating tax practices by MNEs. We can't rely on CBCR alone, though, and certainly not CRD4. We have to have a longer term development of progressive measures here, which encourage good behaviour and require good behaviour and maintain good behaviour. So the true potential of CBCR is not going to be felt until it's implemented globally and consistently across industries with high quality standards. So recent moves by the European Parliament in this direction are positive, but we have to wait and see the details before we can say that that's the right next step. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frankie, for this positive view. And what I think is interesting is that you also mentioned that now companies may want to compete. If they don't want to compete to be good companies, they may want to compete to expand of at least do something else than being a good company. So that's quite interesting, because normally, for instance, the Global Reporting Initiative that was developed by business, as I mentioned, has been seen as one of the ways that the companies may say, we are being compliant and we are even dealing with this. We are addressing this issue. So that's quite interesting. You will have some questions. There are some questions in the chat. Just please feel to let everyone to ask the questions on the chat, and then after we will come back. And now we will have the presentation from Frederick Heitmuller, who is the PhD also in the GLOBTAXGOV. And he kind of says, well, it's not negative, it's not positive, but kind of be careful. And be careful with the access to the data. And this is one of the things that, for instance, in GLOBTAXGOV, we have been looking at, whether developing countries truly have the instruments, the elements, the regulatory framework to be able to exchange this data. And that's one of the hopefully answers that Frederick will provide, of at least the questions. So Frederick, go ahead.
All right, you can see my slides, right? Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is, well, one important element in the debate now around introduction of public CBCR in the EU is often the functioning of the current system of confidential exchanges of CBCRs, which is already in place now for a couple of years, and which is one of the minimum standards of the OECD BEPS project. So opponents of publication would argue that publicizing the reports is not necessary because there's already a working system. Supporters, on the other hand, argue that the current system is actually not working that well, and public CBCR would bring added value. So in this presentation, I'm exploring this question is a little bit. This is work in progress still, but I think well, there's some interesting findings to share, and I'm would be very happy about any kind of feedback. Also, I'm focusing here on the narrow purpose of CBCR, so helping tax authorities detect tax avoidance by MNEs. And I will discuss essentially two major challenges, which is accessing all the relevant data on MNEs that operate in the country, and second, making effective use of this data. Regarding access, the current system works by automatic exchange of information. This means that tax administrations collect CBCRs from MNEs which are headquartered in their country and send the data to administrations of the other countries where a given MNE has a subsidiary, under the conditions that there is a legal basis for such exchange. According to information published by the OECD, there are currently 4,900 exchange relations in place, where one relationship corresponds to one exchange into one direction. So if two countries exchange information with each other, that's two relationships. If we compare that number with the hypothetical number, if information was exchanged among all jurisdictions of the world, then this would be a coverage about 7% currently. If we just take all jurisdictions of the BEPS inclusive framework as benchmark, then right now 25% would be covered. Now, of course, one argument is that maybe these 4,900 already cover most of the relevant MNE activity, because after all, most large MNEs with higher revenue than 750 million euro are concentrated in few countries only. And some countries may not host subsidiaries of such big MNEs. So there could be a relationship, but there wouldn't be any data to exchange. So to investigate a bit more closely to what extent the potentially relevant exchanges take place, I started looking at some more information. I think there are several potential ways to approach this question, but for the moment I've considered only one public data source, which is the analytical database on individual multinationals and affiliates, the ADIMA database, also published by the OECD, which contains information about the 500 biggest MNEs regarding the presences that they have in different countries. It's presented as an attempt to create a global business register. So basically you can see how many subsidiaries but also other types of physical presence an MNE has in different jurisdictions. And in addition, it also surveys digital presences, so in the form of websites and domains. So right now, this website does not trigger an obligation to send the CBCR, but it might in the future if some agreement on a digital nexus of companies is reached. These 500 MNEs, they're headquartered in 36 different countries, most of them in the US, the EU considered as a whole, and China. And in total, these have about 14,000 presences in foreign countries, whereby one presence counts if one MNE has one or more physical or digital presences in a foreign country. Only physical. If we add digital, the number would be 16,400 more or less. And so now I compared this with the data on exchange relationships. And we can see that depending on if we count digital presences and what benchmark we use on the inclusive framework for all countries, in between 58 and 67% of these presences are currently covered by exchanges, so that countries can receive data about these MNEs which operate in their country. That's not exhaustive, especially if we consider that the percentage is likely to be lower if we had data on all MNEs, which potentially are subject to CBCR. I don't know for sure how many that is. I put there a figure of 1,950, which is based on a very rough calculation where I looked in the Forbes Global 2000 list of companies and looked at all those which have a higher revenue than 750 million euros. So, but I'm not so sure about this figure. On the next slide, we can see how the situation varies among countries. In the lower left corner, we have an accumulation of countries which do not receive information, but which also only have few MNEs. Along the left axis, we have those which are well covered. And towards the right corner, we have those countries which have many foreign MNEs in the country, but do not receive any information. And in the middle are those which receive information, some, but not all. And interestingly, there with countries such as Germany, France, China, the US. So what can explain the situation? The next graph plots all jurisdictions of the inclusive framework. Basically, for all others, the explanation is that they are not part of the inclusive framework. But now let's look at the ones that are in the inclusive framework. And on top, we see the number of countries from which they receive information on the bottom, and on the top where they send it to. I think we can basically say three things. First, on the right side, the graph still continues, but there are no bars anymore. These are countries which neither send nor receive information. And the reason is in general that they have not yet signed or ratified the multilateral competent authority agreement to exchange CBCRs, which is the necessary legal basis. These are mainly inclusive framework members from Africa. Second, we can see that a number of countries send information, but do not receive any, or only receive very few. These are countries which have opted for a non-reciprocal way of implementing CBCR. The reason is essentially that complying with the BEPS minimum standards on Action 13 means that the country needs to pass laws and administrative procedures that ensure confidential treatment and appropriate use of the information. And choosing to only send information but not receive means that you comply with the standard, but you do not have to implement these kinds of regulations. A few of these countries are countries without CIT, so that makes sense. But there are also a few others, such as Nigeria, Costa Rica, Romania, Bulgaria, where this raises some questions, which I do not have an exhaustive answer yet. And third, we can see that not all countries send to the same number of other countries. The reason is here that countries have the choice between joining the multilateral convention or choosing a bilateral way of applying CBCR, and select or negotiate individually with countries to whom exchange this data. And we can see among those countries that have done so are China and the US, which, as we have seen, are home to about half of the 500 biggest MNEs. Then this map explains to a large extent the earlier graph. We can see, for example, that Germany and France do not receive information from the US. Many of the countries in the developing world do not receive information from one or both of China or the US. And I do not yet know the specific dynamics behind this, but this would be interesting for future investigation. Now, I've talked a lot about access, but what about use of the information by tax authorities? So once the information is received, first, I think it would be interesting to quote a recent report by the EU Court of Auditors, which investigated this question in 5 EU countries and found that basically only one of these 5 countries, the Netherlands, did some extensive analysis of the information received. I did some research in Colombia and India on the implementation of BEPS more generally in the last years, and heard more or less similar stories from officials in these countries. So basically, it's often a question of capacity. It can also be a question of separation of functions, which are kind of a result of the conditions to use the information appropriately. And it can also be differences between what the data says and the tax rules of the country. So definitions of profit, definitions of revenue. So what this is somewhat difficult to interpret for countries sometimes. Finally, that's more theoretical consideration. Unequal access may lead to an availability bias. So basically, if you only receive information from MNEs of certain countries, but not from others, you may think that these which you have information on are the more risky ones and look more in detail at those, but this may not actually be the case. Now, finally, a bit on, I calculated with this data the impact of some hypothetical scenarios on access. First, what would happen to this data if the EU introduced public CBCR for all companies headquartered in the EU? So that would basically mean that all countries could receive data on EU headquartered companies. And this would, depending on the group, the benchmark you use, this would raise access by in between 6 and 10 percentage points. Why not more? Well, because as we've seen, the bigger issues in terms of data access are maybe the US and the Chinese MNEs. So the next is what would happen if presences, what would happen if China and the US and all countries would step to a multilateral application of the current system, so that the US and China and other countries would not cherry pick, but send to all signatories of the CBC convention. So this would raise coverage by in between 12 to 14 percentage points. And the last point is, well, what would happen if the EU obliged all subsidiaries of MNEs, which are foreign but have a presence in the EU, to publish their data? And then the coverage would go up to 99%, but that's quite unlikely to happen. Although in the current EU directive, there's the draft on the public CBCR directive, there's a paragraph which would introduce a comply and explain system So that foreign subsidiaries of subsidiaries of foreign MNEs have to publish data on their MNE or explain why they're not why not, but only for MNEs with medium-sized or large subsidiaries in the EU. So, and with this data, I cannot distinguish between these. So that is very hypothetical. Finally, well, what to do about use? Essentially, I think that capacity building takes time, and there's no really a magic bullet. But until now, it seems that one solution may still be underexplored. I think this might be a project for academia or more jointly to develop some open source software solution to facilitate risk analysis for tax authorities based on CBCR data. Maybe there are already projects like this ongoing, which I'm not aware of. I know that the OECD is developing software solutions, and there may be some commercial products. Yeah, but I think this could maybe be something valuable to explore. Well, thank you very much. This was it, and looking forward to feedback.
Thank you so much, Frederick. And we will give the last 5 minutes of this set of presentations to Dana. She will present the situation of the Czech Republic, where the CBCR data is not being used. And then thereafter, we will have the questions. Just please keep asking, putting them in the chat, because I will give you the questions. Dana?
Thank you, Irma. I was asked to give a brief overview of the situation in the Czech Republic, because our country is quite different from the others. And the main reason is that there is a scarce of data. There is a scarce of data for us as researchers from the Ministry of Finance. Even though that before CBCR, Ministry of Finance already introduced a special supplement to a tax return in which an entity should claim all the connections regarding transfer pricing and so on, and they gained quite a lot of data from it. It was not, or it is still not available for the researchers. And the same is true for CBCR, even though that the researchers has asked for the data just to analyze them and to, like, let's say, to come up with some policy implications for the Ministry of Finance. Even though this fact, we have been refused to be given the data. And it's not only about those type of data, but about the data in general, it's extremely difficult. Therefore, at least Czech Republic, of course, is going to have a position that it's not wise to have CBCR data publicly available. But from my position, I think that we should lobby that at least from the European Commission side, researchers could get some type of anonymous data just to do a research, and think that there should be an initiative of the researchers on EU level just to ask for that opportunity to be able to get the data. Because yesterday I was looking on the side of OECD and on availability of the data from CBCR, and it's really it's terrible, because it's very, very limited. So that's from my side.
Thank you so much, Dana. We have questions and we have 25 minutes. So I will take the liberty to read the questions, but if someone wants to specifically clarify the question, if there is any clarification needed, I will give the possibility to ask it with the camera. So we have a question from Donald from Nigeria. He was wondering whether there is, to what extent, a standardization of report terms by regulatory bodies, accountants, etc., can increase the utility of data in CBCR. I think that that question could go perhaps to Frankie, but I'm not sure if it would be okay for you. So I'll ask some questions, and then you can have time to think about it. So from Cassandra directly to Sila, a relevant, will the lack of overlap be equally problematic for the revenue authorities trying to audit taxpayer behavior? Her experiences with transfer pricing auditors in East Africa, that they have expectations on the positive impact of getting access to CBCR files. The question of Daniela is on the proposal. That is more AU question. I think that we could go with that one to Dana. My question is on the proposal on disclosure of income tax information by certain undertakings and branches, the public country by country reporting, as there is currently a specific AU directive on CBC, why AU initiative on public CBCR is still indexed to directive, that number, rather than being added to the DAC. So it's kind of like the tax accounting discussion on the public country by country reporting. I will have these 3 questions and one to also to Frankie, regarding Professor Hans Gripno discussing on trust. So the people place trust in a person they find trustworthy. Dimensions of trustworthiness are competence or reliability of for instance, of data, and motivation or intention that guides behavior. Could differentiating between these 2 dimensions be helpful for the analysis? Hopefully you were able to follow up the questions. So, and if not, we will try to see, clarify the questions. So Frankie, can I give the word to you first?
Absolutely, yes, thank you. And firstly, Donald, yes, thank you for your question. I am an accountant myself, and yes, 100%, absolutely. I think that the standardization of report terms is essential. It's one of the fundamental principles of accounting data that information should be comparable. I think it's very hard to do any sensible work in this space without that. And I think it's interesting to look at how standards are put together and how the role of, for example, accountancy firms and specialist tax accountants have behaved within the space where these standards are being drawn up, to see how we get these inconsistent terms or undefined terms. But yes, consistency of terms and definitions is critical. And for Professor Gribnow, again, thank you for your question. I think that could be a really useful dimension. It helps us, I think, particularly differentiate between the trust you can deliver with a mandatory reporting requirement where intention and motivation look very different, and the trustworthiness that comes from voluntary disclosure, where of course the motivations and intention can be both much more suspect, but also the motivation is to some extent to demonstrate that you're doing good and to appear good because you're going above and beyond. So I think that's a very useful dimension. Thank you for introducing that.
Yes, thank you. Dana, would you like some clarification on the question from Daniela Pessoa?
Yeah, well, I think I got it. I think that's the main question, because I can't read it in the chat. I can't find the question. The basic thing is that the CBCR directive, as it is not requiring either companies or the states or the Commission to public this data. The discussion about the CBCR directive, which would force to public this data, is currently on the table. I think it's currently, or it is currently under discussion. I have to say that I'm not fond of full publication of those data, because I do understand that also it's kind of about the strategies of the companies. And I think that it can be very sensitive commercial information. However, I think there should be a mechanism which would allow the government bodies to provide this data to researchers and of course in anonymous form. Therefore, I think that the discussion is relevant, but we should have in mind that this information may be the part of, I don't know how it's called, commercial secret, how is the correct legal term for it? And I think there should be a proper legal framework for disclosure of this information.
Yeah, and I was wondering whether also the EU data that is being discussed in the public country by country reporting is the same as the tax data from the CBCR, because one is accounting, the another one is tax. So this is being very careful, because I don't believe that in the discussion of public country by country reporting there are tax people. So that could be interesting.
Yeah.
Craig, you have a very long question. So if I read it, I think that I will lose everyone. Would you mind to just ask, because it's to Sila and it's about the extractive industry? And a very interesting question, by the way.
Hi there, everyone. So the thing that struck me between both Sila's presentation and Frankie's presentation is that both considered very specialized industries. One was mining, one was banking. And I think they have some different concerns. I'm going to paraphrase my question because it's long and it's in the chat. But essentially, what I'm asking is, in mining, the defense for mining incentives is very often you need to consider the life cycle of the mine, because it has a very set life cycle process. And so you need to consider the tax consequences over the full production cycle from inception right until death of the mine. So, you know, to what extent does that perhaps answer some of your concerns around CBC reporting, and perhaps that it's not fit for purpose in a mining context because it's a snapshot in time? And then similarly with the banking that Frankie was looking at, you know, the banking industry suffered from enormous trust issues after the financial crisis. So they've got far more to gain by promoting their activities and being global leaders in CBC reporting, because they need to regain the trust. So is that not perhaps something that should temper your research? And so that's kind of a question to both of you.
Yes, please, Frankie first and then after Sila, perhaps. Is that good? Okay.
Sure, absolutely. I think it's definitely something to be borne in mind. I would also put the direction perhaps in the other way. You're absolutely right about the impact of the banking industry, of the financial crisis, particularly reputationally. I think that made them more vulnerable to legislation in this area, which is why we now have this standard. I think the standard with the mandatory reporting requirement was introduced because of those trust issues. I think we see something very similar happening in parallel at the moment with the significantly more prominent conversation about taxes on digital companies, given the way digital company reputations have been affected by activities over the last year, 2 years, etc. I think that there may be more pressure on banks to be leaders, but I think it's particularly interesting that it's not banks that we're seeing doing additional voluntary disclosure here. It's companies like Vodafone, it's some companies in the resources industries, etc. So I think there are reputational pressures to do well here, but I don't think that banks are leading the charge on CBCR. I think they are required to publish because of regulation introduced because their reputation already took a hit. So I'm not convinced by the argument that they're behaving better on tax because of reputational impacts. I think that they're behaving better on tax because of standards, because of the earlier reputational impacts.
Sila, thank you so much, Frankie. Sila?
Yes, hi everyone, thanks for the questions. I think there's a discussion emerging, which is quite different actually, which is when it comes to the mining industry, some of the questions are on the verge of discussing the nature of the incentives and should they have incentives, which I mean, there are some good of a different other countries. There are perfectly valid arguments for that. then there's discussions on whether that should happen on a project by project basis, in which there's a negotiating process every time. That's a different issue. There's also an issue on should that then be public, right? So what I'm discussing here is not the effectiveness of those incentives, though that is definitely a topic for discussion as well, but rather it is the question of, well, if we don't know the legal regime that they are subject to, we cannot really use the CBCR as well. It's true that we also have to think of the life cycle of the mining project, but that's exactly why we need more information than just the tax payment. I think that's an argument for more information, not less, because if you only have the tax payment for 1 year, but you don't have any information on whether or not it's in the beginning of the project or the end of the project, and the tax rates that they are subject to at different phases of the project are usually different, then you're not any the wiser. So it's really, really important that it should not be a snapshot. It should be an annual reporting, and it should be within a context of the legal regime and the general process of the mine. Something that would, for example, make sense, just as it makes sense for digital companies to publish how many users they have in each country, might also make sense for mining companies to publish not just the tax payment, but also what they extracted. Like that's an actual physical measure, right? I'd like to, I'm gonna quickly share my screen with you for just a second to show you something really fun that I found when reading all of these contracts, which is in one of the contracts, there was an addendum which described the subsidiary structure for Global Alumina, where it's a Canadian company, but then it's a wholly owned, has a wholly owned subsidiary, and it's the shareholder. It is listed on the Toronto Exchange, but then it's also in BVI, the British Virgin Islands. So they have this what they call themselves a two-tier tax haven structure. They say it's commonly accepted by investors worldwide as a more flexible, tax efficient, and sensible means of investing their capital into major cross-border infrastructure investment. So this is something that I found when looking into these companies. And what this shows you is that, well, the tax payments, when you look at the mining sector, yes, there are reasons that they might be low because of the life cycle of the mine, but CBCR might still be relevant for them if they are doing profit shifting. And if you see that companies themselves are saying they have a two-tiered tax haven structure, I think they might be doing profit shifting.
Yeah, thank you, Saila.
If this is what they tell their own investors.
Thank you, Saila. I will give the final two questions that are to Frederick. And one of the things that, Cassandra, would you mind to ask your question on live?
Yes, of course. Let me just see for my screen. Yes, I was just wondering, because one of the observations I made during my research in East Africa, where I talked to transfer pricing auditors, accountants, and so on, is that there was this willingness to get access to the country-by-country reporting and to adopt it on, well, let's say a unilateral basis, that they did not want to be part of this multilateral agreement, but they did want to have access to this information, because one of the barriers that they were confronted with now was when they ask the subsidiaries for some kind of information to help them in their transfer pricing audits or in the preparation of documentation, is that they would say that there is no legal basis for it because they are not part of this agreement. And I just read that, for instance, I think Zambia also put it in their own transfer pricing regulations. I think recently Rwanda as well, something that looks similar to the kind of information that is being distributed under the country-by-country reporting. And I was just wondering how you would interpret this.
Yeah, that's something
Sorry.
Yeah.
There will be another question from Sertini, and I will put those two together and you reply in 3 minutes you will have. Sertini, would you mind to ask your question? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. This is Regina, and I work with Sertini in Uganda. And mine was basically on 2 fronts. One, to consider the zombie transparency, you know, where information is just shared, but just for the sake. So it's just to reinforce the first presentation. Then the second one is for us to consider the different contexts. You know, it's different for developing countries as well as what is happening in Africa. An example is while engaging recently with Uganda Revenue Authority, they were able to tell us that they do not have the required funds to buy, in quotes, the best ICT system. And there are different phases. So if they go in for the second best, that means they miss out on the last one. It's just for us to consider that and discuss the broader discussion in considering the different contexts ideally, like what Cassandra just shared. So thank you.
Thank you, Regina. Frederick, I will give you the word.
Thanks. Yeah, I think, well, Cassandra, I think I've talked with this also about the same reasons with people in India, where it was also the question whether actually you need CBCR exchanges to get the data. So and it seems that in India the tax authority was also sometimes asking companies this kind of question, and that the response would be similar by the company. And I think it's in the end difficult because the headquarter, it's difficult to oblige the headquarter to furnish this information to the subsidiary, which would then give it to the tax authority, because the tax authority is not, the headquarter company is not under the jurisdiction of the respective country. So from a legal perspective, I think it would be the subsidiary will always be able to say we cannot we cannot get that. They just don't send it to us. I think this is probably not easy to solve. Like, as I said, in the EU directive there is now such a sentence, but they also don't go the full way and make it an obligation, but would only would accept an explanation why such data cannot be accessed. I think it's difficult to, it could not be enforced, I think, in the end by the country. And Sertini, I think Frank was also a question to Frankie from my side. Yeah, what I would add to the point on access on accessing ICT solutions, I think, yeah, if of course risk analysis have to be done to some extent by the tax authorities themselves, but yeah, I think it publication of the data in the end could help making this more a public exercise in the end, and that researchers can contribute to this and yeah, help with these issues. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Frederick. I will have a final question for Dana. This question links to, we are also having not only European, but we also have developed countries. We have seen the situation of the US and China, and we have developing countries. And the question is then, what can we tell to developing countries? How they could link this CBCR reporting, the country by country reporting, and the sustainable index?
So thanks for the question. I think it should be rather kind of a wrapping up of our discussion in this session. Well, I think that as the climate change and the sustainability and aggressive tax planning are global challenges. Therefore, the response needs to be on global level. And well, I do think that the CBCR is a tool how to achieve a sustainability in a corporate taxation system or corporate taxation policy. Therefore, from my point of view, I would be also being a policymaker in developing countries, especially in developing countries where multinational corporations having either a place of effective management or headquarters, also in a special industries. I would be asking those companies to fill in or to to fill in this reporting and to report a local tax authority. It can be in some simplified form if there is a lack of know-how on the side of the administration. However, I think it's a tool how to have a global response on a global challenge. And we do know that developed countries do have a deficit regarding extracting profit from developing countries through multinational corporations, especially in mining industries. For example, in Africa, I think that we are talking about something like $400 billion or the amount like this. Therefore, I understand or I do perceive CBCR as a global tool for the response of global challenges which are currently in the world.
This is a very nice way to wrap up today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for staying and for keeping with us the whole afternoon. Thank you to the speakers on the first session, but also in the second session. And I think that from my side, we will have a nice, we will try to write a report, and also the slides will be available, the recording will be available. This is also a way to exchange ideas, so please feel free to change ideas later after this. And Petre, I will just want to give you the last word to you.
All right. Thank you, Irma. And I nothing else to add than words of thank you to all participants, all speakers, and to all those who asked questions. And the final thank you to Irma. Thank you. And let's continue in the research. And it was a pleasure to have all of you here today. Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you so much. Bye.
Thank you for fantastic afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.